even when we started to fundraise or talk to other people, I think it looked like we were incredible because we didn't have that tech background. And I think on the flip side, I think people also realize that, some of these other companies actually don't have the skill set that we have. So I think, it can work in your favor both ways. But in terms of kind of navigating that, I think it was a challenge. I think, the first step was really finding some scientists who would actually be crazy enough to join this.
It's safe to say the meat revolution has begun. There are so many alternatives to meat that have just popped up over the last few years. And on today's podcast, I speak to Tasneem Karodia, co-founder of Mzansi Meat Co, a biotech company focused on the cultivation of meat product. They've actually created Africa's first lab-grown beef patty, and I hear it tastes delicious. So in today's podcast, Tasneem is full of insight as she tells us what it was like moving away from being a CA and a strategy consultant and moving into the biotech industry, a place that she was deeply passionate about but had very little expertise. How has she managed to ramp up that knowledge, hire in the right people, and build a business that I have no doubt is going to revolutionize the way us as Africans look at meat. My name's Kieran Naidu, and you're listening to The Self-Starters, a place where we learn how to turn our ideas into successful action. And because you're listening, you have no excuse not to get started on your idea right this very moment, unless you just want to finish this episode first. Cultivated meat. What is that, and why do you view it as a more sustainable practice into the future?
So for those that don't know what cultivated meat is, it's essentially meat that's grown in a lab. On a base level, you start with a biopsy from an animal, so you do still take some cells from an animal. We're predominantly focused on beef, so we take a few cells in a biopsy from a cow. We are currently working quite a lot with a animal farm sanctuary in Greyton, so we've taken a lot of our biopsies from there, and it's really a 5-minute procedure. It's usually a small kind of size of a peppercorn piece of muscle with a little bit of fat on the shoulder. And within an hour, the animal is up and running. And then the process really from there is to take those cells to the lab, where under very kind of controlled environment and lab conditions, you're taking those cells and trying to grow them. And so, our cells are alive, so it's not like you're doing anything. And all you're doing is really replicating the same process that would be in the cow's body outside of the cow. And so you give it sugars, amino acids, and you give it the right temperature, 37 degrees for mammals, which we all know. And we put it in something in an incubator. That's where we can control the temperature. And after a while, we kind of grow up more and more stock. Now, there's a lot that goes into that, but essentially that's the whole premise of it. And when you have enough stock, you have essentially cultivated meat that can be put into a product. We're currently growing cultivated fat and muscle. So when it comes to meat, there's a whole host of things that, blood, for example, we're not cultivating blood at the moment. So the color as well, we need to play around with. But the end product for us is going to be initially a blended product. So with some plant-based materials, just to give it a bit of structure and give it that color as well that resembles meat. In terms of why I think it's more sustainable, I think for a long time I kind of went down my own personal food journey, and I think the industrial animal agriculture landscape is getting to a point where we've already created as much efficiency that we can in that, and there's a lot of things that I think even now that we've kind of experienced COVID, that we're seeing that the food systems are quite inefficient. We farm animals, they live in quite small and cramped spaces, but even with that, they have to be pumped with hormones, antibiotics, and those kinds of things. And in this process, we don't have those things. We need to give it its nutrients, but the controlled environment doesn't actually mean that you have to pump it full of hormones that stay behind. We do give it certain things to make sure that it grows, but we don't have the same issues. And then in terms of things like land usage and water usage, those things, when it comes to certain species, are much lower, which is a very, very exciting prospect. You get to have the same meat, just made better.
And, Taz, you're a CA who did articles, went through consulting. How did you end up in biotech? And what made you're a co-founder of Mzansi Meat Co. What made you think, I've landed on a great idea that I think it's worth leaving all of that behind and really pushing aggressively to build this company out?
That's a really great question. It was a really long journey, actually. So I kind of always knew my defined path. I'm going to be a CA. And, when you study it, I was like, I really hate auditing. What am I going to do? So I landed up going into consulting, which was a really great platform and career path. But I think for me, it was just, it never felt that it was the thing that I was going to do long term. I got this great skill set and met amazing people and got great experiences, but I never felt really passionate about the industries I was working at or the particular projects that I was doing. There was some cool stuff I did, but it wasn't really where my passion was. And my passion, actually, to go back before even I studied, was I started to develop a passion for kind of sustainability very early on. When I was 16, I read one article or something. I can't even remember where I got this information, but I got information about how unsustainable it is to eat meat, particularly beef, and the emissions that come with that. And that kind of stuck in my mind, and I got very, very into the detail of sustainability, and so I kind of went through my own personal food journey since I was 16. So I cut out red meat immediately, and then gradually started removing all animal products from my diet. Now I don't eat any animal products, except for Mzansi Meat. um, but essentially went on this food journey, and really about 4 to 5 years ago started seeing the emergence of alternative proteins. So I think in South Africa we're quite familiar with companies like Beyond and Oatly, and now there's On the Green side, and products that are coming onto the market that are very good, that can substitute meat. But for me, about 4 or 5 years ago, I started seeing the emergence of these products. I started seeing what it meant for changing people's behaviors. And I just got very excited. I started learning more about these products, learning more about what it takes to kind of take them to market. Initially, it was just very personal. I was like, I just want to try this new product. There's a new mince, there's a new chicken, there's a new egg alternative, there's a new milk. And then it started developing a bit more. And so I started looking at the plant-based sector, really quite really wanted to get into the space. I started interviewing at a company in the US, but with visas being an issue, it became a bit tricky. And so I started having to look at, well, what else would that mean to move into the space? And so I really went on a very long journey of understanding the whole ecosystem, all the players, and what role I would play. So I am an accountant. This is all biotech, or food production, and that's not my area of expertise. So I really had to learn a lot about it. Eventually, I settled on cultivated meat. For me, I just got very excited about the potential. It's got it's innovation and tech, and it's also got a lot of external applications. I think plant-based has somewhat of a limit, even though I consume it quite a lot. I think we do reach a point where some people are still not necessarily convinced by it. You have to highly process a lot of products to really get them to a point where they taste really tasty and can functionally perform like meat and all those things. And while I love them, there is a limit to how many people are actually going to move towards that. So for me, cultivated meat is the same thing. You're giving a like-for-like option that really doesn't actually make the consumer have to make a choice. I think there is, second to that is you have to get price right for that to be true. But when you look at just a product basis, it is the same thing. And I think that's what got me really excited. I'm South African. We see how much people love the braai and like putting things, meat is a staple part of what we eat in South Africa. And so if you are to remove that, it becomes very, very difficult to kind of move and change people in that way. And so you have to give them a better option. And so I got very excited about it. I then went on a journey of looking at every cultivated meat company in the world, and there aren't that many. There are a lot now. There are probably about 100 companies now. But when I started looking at this, there really were. It was very easy for me to know every single company and the progress that they had made to date. And I reached out to them. I think the one thing, which is a bit disheartening, is like at that time my skill set doesn't fit what they needed. So I really did have to look at, okay, if I want to be in this space, what does it mean to be in this space? And I at the time was just very passionate about moving into this space that I was like, I will work for free. I will do anything. I will come to your company. Just let me do it. And some people had a lot of conversations, but I think at the time when it's a very tech focused part of the industry, I really couldn't add a lot of value. So I really
Mm.
had to rethink what that would look like. I think it did take a lot more time than I think. I would have wanted to move into the space a lot sooner, but everything kind of happens for a reason. And I really moved into the space when I was probably ready to move into the space and knew a lot more to actually contribute to it. So I actually got connected to my co-founder rather fortuitously. I was looking at the space, wanted to move into the space, and there's a report for anyone who is interested in this industry. There's a company called the Good Food Institute, and they write a lot of interesting information about this industry, from plant-based fermentation to cultivated meat, and their overviews are really, really helpful. And so I read their report in 2019. It came out in 2020, right when I was ready to move into the space, or getting antsy about moving into the space. And I decided to join the webinar because I read the report, knew everything in it, but I just didn't know what I was actually. I don't know why I joined the webinar, because I read everything and I knew everything. Not to say I know everything, but like I was just like, well, let me just join this webinar. Maybe something new will come up. And luckily it did, because there was a company whose logo Mzansi Meat was on, and I saw it, knew it was South African, or was very curious if another place in the world could have a word Mzansi, and immediately reached out. So I got connected to Brett. There really was just a logo, so he got in time for a logo. The idea had already been kind of there, and there was a form of a website, but nothing much else. So I got very excited to be able to get connected to someone who's very excited about doing cultivated meat, had been able to kind of post about it, because I was not even living in South Africa at the time. So to find another South African, I don't know if our circles would have met if he didn't go through that step. And when I saw that, immediately I was like, I got to get connected. We had a chat, and kind of rest is history. And from there, kind of been on this crazy journey of actually creating an industry on the continent, which is both daunting and very exciting. But that's kind of my whole journey and how I kind of got into this. And I think starting a company was probably the only way for me to actually contribute. And I think what was lucky is my co-founder, Brett, is also not a scientist. So he understood what it means to have a non-scientific background to wanting to start a company. I think he knew what it would take to actually take this company, well, not just from an R&D kind of hub to actually a company that is going to sell meat to people. So I got very lucky to get connected to someone who actually understands, that side of it and what's needed.
I find that fascinating. I mean, to have two founders who both aren't in that R&D space, and you're in biotech, so R&D is, I guess, the foundation for everything you guys do. Talk to me about that. How do you guys go about then creating your product, actually making sure that at the end of the day, the two of you are always aware of what's going on with your product? Especially if you don't necessarily understand the exact science behind it, or are you at a point now where you guys do understand the exact science behind it? How have you gone through that process of growth and understandings, such that if you had to reach out to another biotech company now, they wouldn't say, "Oh, I don't think your skills are misaligned." They'd be like, "Well, jeepers, you're an expert in cultivated meat."
Yeah, I think it was difficult, and I think even when we started to fundraise or talk to other people, I think it looked like we weren't credible because we didn't have that tech background. And I think on the flip side, I think people also realize that some of these other companies actually don't have the skills that we have. So I think it can work in your favor both ways. But in terms of kind of navigating that, I think it was a challenge. I think the first step was really finding some scientists who would actually be crazy enough to join this, which we did. They are amazing. We've got an amazing team, and they've made amazing progress. But I think initially, and I mean, it's a continuous challenge that we're working through, is how do we communicate? Because fundamentally, they're academics. A lot of them are academics who spend time in a university setting in a lab and never really had to think about commercial applications. And I think there's a learning both ways. I had to learn about the science, and so I don't often go into the lab because they probably get irritated. But I go into the lab and I learn about what they're doing, and I've read about the science to understand it on a base level enough to talk about it and understand what questions to ask. And I think the biggest thing that I learned in consulting is you don't have to be an expert on a particular industry to be able to really dig into the core of what is happening. And I think that's kind of the approach that I took to understanding this. What are the key things that we need to know? What are the key, roadblocks we will have and risks, and how do then I go about mitigating it? And I think what I do a lot of is ask a lot of questions and ask the right questions to kind of get to the root cause of problems. And I think that's kind of the way that we go about it. And I think there's other things that you can do. We obviously have, sessions where we kind of talk about the science and the business, because again, both sides need to know what's happening. And we have sessions where we just talk about technical stuff. And so I think that's one way that we've kind of got ourselves up the curve. I think we are at the point where we can have conversations with very technical people and understand what they're talking about. And I think it's very important that everyone in the business can talk about everything that we're doing. We're still a very small team. We're 7 people. So there's not like a ton of redundancy. So we have to create it ourselves. And so we kind of just try and keep the communication up.
I really find it fascinating. And when you mentioned the team now, you have quite a formidable team at Mzansi Meat Co. And what lessons can you share with people who are looking to build a team? Like what should they look for, especially when they're in a situation like you, where you have to put your trust in others, especially because a lot of the time, and more specifically initially, they would have more of the background understanding to the R&D and the building blocks of what's required to build this business and have a successful product. So how do you go about finding them and then putting your trust in them? Because again, I'll use an old analogy, but if I had to go to a mechanic, and if my mechanic told me, listen, your carburetor's broken, your radiator's broken, your tires are below a threshold, even if there's no threshold, I'm just talking nonsense here, I'd be like, yes, okay, how much do I have to pay? Because I have no understanding. Obviously, you guys have done your research, but as you speak to people and looking to bring them into the business, they get to a point where they're speaking so technically, you're just going to be like, give me a moment. Me and Britt need to go and speak and make sure that we're aligned on what you're actually saying. So how did you bring people in? How do you put your trust in others? Is it an easy thing? Is it hard? Because especially when it's your baby, I can imagine it's quite tough.
Yeah, I mean, let me tackle the kind of how we put the trust. I think for me, always been in an environment where I could control the outcome to a large extent. I could plug into everything, and if something wasn't going to plan, I could control whether it got finished or not. So I could always plug in and remove a roadblock. I think now in this environment where, as you say, R&D is the building blocks, and that is what needs to happen before anything else really happens. I think that was a huge thing for me to learn to let go of. And I think I needed to learn, how do I get comfortable in this environment where I can't control that? So I think I had to learn what I could control and where I could help the R&D team, because I think really at the end of the day, it's about the business really helping R&D to kind of get our product out. And so huge learning. I think in general, you've got to build trust in a team, and that comes with actually getting to know your team and spending time with your team inside the office and outside the office. And I think you've got to create rapport to really foster that trust. And once you have that, you are able to kind of not always let go, but actually at least understand the people that you're working with, to know how they work, how they like to work, and provide feedback, and also when you know they're going to be struggling. So I think it's really, you really have to spend time as a team. And that's kind of, I think I raised this point before we started recording, but I don't necessarily entirely think that working remote works, because I really think there's something to be said about working as a cohesive team, which actually needs time spent together. Sometimes it's hard physically, and I think there are environments where that works better, but our team has to be in the lab all the time. If I can do my job remotely, but if I didn't spend any time with them, I would not know anything about the R&D side. And, it's sometimes just overhearing a conversation that actually helps my understanding, where I can just, you've said that, but last week you said this, help me fit those pieces together. So I think that's one thing about whatever team you're building. How do you kind of get yourself more comfortable? In terms of how we built this specific team, I think a lot of it we got very lucky, which I'm very happy about. But I think on the other side is that biotech exists in South Africa. cultivated meat does not. And so we really had to look at what kind of skill set do we need initially, and in the beginning we needed people that had tissue culture experience, people that know how to culture cells. And so that's kind of, we already had a defining starting point for what we needed for our R&D team. We kind of went down that path. I think the key thing that we look for in a team member is, are you mission driven? And mission driven doesn't mean you need to be vegan or whatever. I think we've got someone on our team, well, actually it's only Brett and I that don't eat meat. The rest of the team actually eats meat. And I think it's really important to have diversity on the team, because at the end of the day we're building a meat product, and I can taste it, but we also need people that
you need you need someone to be like, I'm still going to go and buy a real beef patty from Woolworths, and
exactly.
The taste is different. Yeah,
makes sense. So we've got our initial member, like Kyle, who has a PhD. I think a lot of it was like, how do we find those PhDs? And we've got relationships now with universities to really find. That's usually for our more junior staff, and then it really is about kind of headhunting. There are people in the medical research field and pharmaceuticals that have the skill set. And so it's about finding them and bringing them onto our team. And so we work with recruiters, but we also look at kind of headhunting people that have the right skill set. And I think the other thing that has also worked for us is that we are trying to be an outward-facing brand. I think this is a new concept, so we also need to get the education level up. And so speaking on platforms like this helps broaden the audience that see us and know us. And I think also kind of will eventually reach people that could potentially work with us. And I think, it was really about being quite defined on what we were looking for from a skill set point of view. And then also just making sure that our processes were looking for people that were mission driven and really wanted to be it. I think the big thing is we looked at a lot of academics, but they are very academic. And so fitting into a startup environment is not necessarily one that they enjoy, or that they would thrive in. And so we had to find the right intersection with people that were able to kind of be flexible and move into this environment, but were mission driven, and again also had the right skill set.
That's fascinating. And the thing is, it seems like the team really is mission driven. So this year you developed Africa's first lab grown beef patty, if I'm not mistaken. That sounds huge. I'd love to hear more about that process, and what now, having done that, what that means for the business going forward.
We're really excited. I mean, for me, it meant that I got to eat beef for the first time in 15, 16 years. So I was just very excited.
Ultimately, that's all it comes down to. It's like,
I'm doing this for myself. It's very selfish, and I think like that's why I will continue and plug on until the very end, because I'd love to eat meat again. Which again, very mission driven. Could be selfish, doesn't matter. But when I was younger, growing up, I loved meat, so it wasn't that I didn't like it. My brother says I was like the biltong queen, and now it's very obviously hard for me. There are some better substitutes, but still not the same. So I mean, that moment I think was just a tremendous moment for the entire team. We've been going since 2020, and really about 18 months of R&D, where whenever someone asked me what I was doing, it was, we're doing cultivated meat. Do you have products? No. Can you show me? No, I can't show you anything. And so I think it's very hard, not just for me, who's not a scientist, but for even our science team who are on the ground seeing stuff when it hasn't become tangible and real. And so to be able to do a product, which is obviously revolutionary for the continent, was just an amazing moment. For us internally, but also externally, because I think there's a lot of excitement and buzz about this. I think on the African continent, there's huge food security issues. There's a protein gap. Population is growing, and where will food come from? And so we've got to solve those challenges. And so for us, it's very exciting to be able to see that we are making the progress that we need. It was amazing. We did it as an event, so we showcased burgers, and we were able to kind of we cooked them in the background, and the smell just permeated, which was really, really cool. Because if you've ever cooked a veggie burger, you don't get that. You don't get the grill. You don't get the mouthfeel. They're dry. They're whatever other kind of comments people can make, but they're not. They aren't meat. And this really was just It was meat grilling at the back of a very large room that made its way and smell and aroma just throughout the venue, and people just got very excited because it is meat and it smelled like meat, and people got to witness it. So it was a very exciting moment. It took a lot. It was a long journey for us to get there, but I think it meant quite a lot, because I think now what it means for our team is that we now know that we can do it. We always knew we could do it, but now we can tell people we can do it. And now it's really about optimizing our processes to make more. So we're still in the early phases of that, kind of moving from the lab outside of the lab to kind of a bench scale. And it's now about, increasing our capacity, optimizing that capacity, and then really hopefully taking this to market. And then for us, being based in South Africa, a lot of people think about the industry and they're like, well, why in South Africa? Other people have so much more money. And I think we've got an opportunity to leapfrog what other people are doing. What we did in 18 months, some people took a couple of years to do, or did it shorter, but not as much as we were able to do. And so I think for us, it's really, how do we get to market faster than anyone else, and scale it up cheaper than anyone else? Because for this industry, the biggest thing is unit economics. That's what everyone talks about. How do we get this to be the same price as beef or less? And there's still a lot of work that we need to do to get there. But the next step really is hopefully getting into food service at some point.
Is it a bit like the arms race or the space race, where it's I guess a whole bunch of meat alternatives racing against each other to gain popularity, I guess, in the general populace's palate, if that makes sense. Do you have that sense of, if we don't get it right first, some chickpea alternative is going to take over the market? Is there that sense?
I think for a lot of us in the cultivated meat space, they're not our competitors. I know from the Mzansi perspective, we believe our competition is conventional meat. We're trying to compete on shelf with conventional meat. We want it to be, whatever it's going to land up looking at like in retail, but it needs to be on the same shelf. It needs to be, someone's looking at conventional beef burgers and looking at Mzansi burgers, and they're like, this is the better choice because of, whatever they care about. Is it environment? Is it animal welfare? Is it health? That's the pack that I'm going for. And so from our perspective, that's who our competition is. I think the other thing that I think a lot of people think with this is that there will be only one winner from the cultivated meat, side. And I would say that's not the case with meat today. Why would that be the case with this new technology for food? You have different plant-based options. You will have different cultivated meat options. And I think we're not at the stage where, we're doing burgers. Some people are doing cultivated scallops and, chicken and all these other things. And eventually we want to branch out into other species, but, there's still a lot of room and there's still a lot of white space. And until we reach a point where we're actually selling and other people are selling, will there potentially be consolidation in the market? But we're not at that stage. I think on the plant-based side, there's still a role to play. Our initial product is going to be blended, so we're going to blend it with some plant-based, and I don't think they would. I think there's a fundamentally different category that gets created with cultivated meat, and it's not taking away from plant-based. I think a lot of people who are plant-based have already been convinced of whatever they need to be convinced of to make a change, and they're not easily going to switch just to cultivated. I think personally, as I said, I haven't eaten meat, and I have eaten our product, and I will eat our product, but I'll still predominantly be plant-based. So I'm also not the necessarily target market. I'm looking at all the meat eaters or the flexitarians who want to make changes but find it hard.
I think, and I think what you're saying is really valid. I think there are a lot more people who will never say no to meat, but will happily go across to an alternative that tastes the same. I'm Indian. I grew up eating a lot of veg, and I love vegetarian food, but I'll never stop eating meat, right? However, if you give me an alternative, exactly like Mzansi Meat Co, and you say it's more sustainable, it's better for the environment, do your bit to help, of course. Right? The biggest issue that comes there is the price, which you've mentioned, the unit economics. How close are you to getting to that price? Is it now just a factor of scale, or is there still more to be done?
There's a few things. One of them is definitely scale. So kind of the next phase within the next 24 months is actually increasing scale. With that, there are a few things. You can't just increase scale if you're not efficient. So it will still be a high price point. So I think for us, there's a few things. Is bringing the variable cost down. One of the biggest kind of costs from a variable cost side is media. That media is still quite high, and we've got to bring that cost down. And so some of that is scale related, but a lot of it is actually finding a different input. And we have, plans to get that cost down. It's just a case of time and innovating to get to that point. We're working with some external suppliers who should get that price point down within the next 12 to 18 months. The next one is efficiency. So that's kind of what we're doing in the next 6 months now, is optimizing what we're getting out of even the capacity that we have. How do we make sure that for as much media we put, or the variable costs we put in, we get as much out? And so at the moment, there's a lot that we can optimize. And so we're working through what kind of kinetics need to work, and how do we actually we grow them in, we call them bioreactors, but they're really just, the same kind of vessels that you see at a brewery, those steel vats. That's what they grow in. That's what kind of meat grows in. And so we need to optimize the process that happens within that. And then the third one is getting up to scale, is actually now producing more of that, because then you get more unit economics for as you scale. But it's kind of like all three of those are going to get us the right kind of price. In terms of when we get there, it's still a long journey. It's probably still a 5 to 10 year kind of time horizon before you get there. And I think the key thing is that a lot of technology has to also progress a bit, because to scale up is still quite expensive. So the capital expenses that you have to put down. And so there are companies working specifically on that. And we suspect within the next 3 to 5 years, you will have better priced capital that also just makes this industry just more affordable and accessible to everyone.
And so we know the term farm to table, but from biopsy to burger, what's the current timeline, and how much are you looking to speed that up by?
So the process is a 3-week process essentially. In terms of increasing that, it's very difficult, because essentially you've got to, from biopsy, we don't take a biopsy every time we're growing cells. We've got when we take a biopsy, we establish it, we kind of make sure that it's stable and it can continue growing. And so we've done that on a few cell lines, and there's one that's performing really well that we don't need to necessarily go back and do anything to it. So it's growing really well. So once we've done the R&D side, which let's take the time out of that, but once we start and we say we want to grow burgers, that's a 3-week process. And the real reason that it's a 3-week process is because when cells start growing, they first need to grow flat in a flask. They like to be close to each other, but not too close. So when they hit the edges of the flask, they stop growing. So you have to kind of divide them and move them into bigger spaces, essentially. But you can't start putting them in a 1,000-liter bioreactor, because then it's too much space. Then they're not close enough together. So you really have to build up the stock. So basically we call them seeding the bioreactors. And so you have to grow up enough stock, split them into bigger vessels, put them into bigger vessels, and then put them into the biggest vessel where they're growing. And that process just takes time to grow up those cells so that they can grow in the bioreactor. And so it's a 3-week process. You really can't, cells kind of have whatever their doubling time is or growth rate is, and they really kind of stick around that. You can't make them grow much, much faster. What you can do is make sure that in that process, you are getting more out at the end than before. And so that's the part that needs to be optimized within the 3 weeks. So, maybe now we're getting, this is an example, but maybe you get one burger now for 3 weeks. We aim to, for that same 3 weeks, to get 20 burgers for the same capacity. So that's the part that gets optimized, how much actually you're getting out after 3 weeks.
And comparatively, how does it, if you had to compare, I guess, the same volume of cultivated meat to what you'd get from a cow, what's the differential in the resources and the space required? Do you have those comparisons?
I think it's still very early in the kind of industry to really give accurate numbers. At the moment, there's still a few assumptions that go into that. We chose beef for a few reasons. One, the price point is a bit better than chicken. Chicken is very cheap. but two, the sustainability aspect of it as well. It, early kind of research suggests that at least from an emissions point of view, you probably can get up to 5 times less emissions
Sure.
with something like cultivated meat. Now, there are other calculations that you can do for land use, and it is definitely lower. But the other thing is a lot of these assumptions are also based on US data or other places, and we're starting to look at, well, how can we do this and South Africanize it? So how do we look at what the local landscape for those things are? Because our agricultural processes are slightly different. And in some, for chicken, it's kind of exactly the same, but there are, for beef, it's not maybe, we do have industrial agricultural processes that are kind of mechanized and all those things, but we do also still get some cows that are free roaming. And so we've got to look at like, what does it mean in the South African context for those numbers, land usage and water usage. But from kind of data that we have seen, it is less. But we really have to also get to scale to really prove what that amount actually is. Because again, we're inefficient. So I would say we're not yet at the stage where we are more efficient than the current processes.
But I mean, we've seen it in other spaces, right? Electric vehicles, green energy. It really is. It's less efficient until it isn't, and then all of a sudden, it's like it is the obvious choice.
Yeah.
With that though, it, as you've mentioned, it requires time, and it sounds like you guys have external funders. Talk to me a bit about the pressures of that. I mean, so, and I'm curious to know from someone who has gone through the conventional route and has worked in a very stressful environment in strategy consulting. Yes, but is it a different kind of stress? Is it a similar type of stress? What is that transition like, and that feeling of knowing that there are people who have put their faith in you, have given you their money, and are waiting to see some results.
It is very stressful, but it is a different kind of stress to a consulting environment. I think the one thing that's different is that I have a lot more ownership. I think in consulting, we would give a recommendation, and I don't even know if those recommendations were followed. A lot of the time, they weren't followed, which is quite
Most
disheartening.
Most of the time,
to put your, like maybe sometimes they were. I'm going to be a bit optimistic, but a lot of the time they're not followed, and so you've done and stressed and stayed up late and did all these things and broke your back for something that actually someone didn't care about.
Yeah.
And that's a generalization, and that was just some of my experience. And there are places where the recommendations do kind of get taken forward, but a lot of the time I wasn't personally connected to those problems, and so for me it was hard to necessarily care as much, even though I spent a lot of time doing it. And now I think all the time that gets spent is really, I can see the outcome, even if it's small things. We're a small team, so sometimes it's just like, well, we've got to make sure that our office looks, like a home, and that everyone kind of paints, and we get our logo up, and then it's like, oh wow, this is we're a real company, and that's an office, and that's like, I didn't have to break my brain to do those things, but I did have to take time out and did it, but I saw the outcome, and I could see the thing that was great about it. And so I think there is a difference when you, one, care about the thing that you're doing, and two, have the ownership because it means so much more. And so with that, there is a different stress. I think fundraising in particular is a very different beast. It's a full-time job in its own, especially fundraising in Africa. I think that it's difficult to fundraise in Africa for things that are not fintech. Kind of the use case has been proven for fintech. People see the opportunity, but for other things, they don't see the opportunity. It's why Africa really did that with their infrastructure. Are you going to be able to make capital payments? So we've been really lucky. We also look at mission-driven investors who are looking at this industry from kind of either passion or kind of future-forward thinking. And so we've got a lot of international investors. We've got a few South African investors as well, but a lot of them kind of understood that this is the future of food, which is really, really exciting. So with that, the stress from our investors is different as well. They kind of know coming into this is a long-term time horizon. And so we've been lucky in that regard that that's how we manage it. I mean, I think there is, with any startup, in the beginning, you kind of miss timelines because you didn't, especially with R&D and innovation, it's very difficult to estimate how long things are going to take. So we have, initially missed deadlines, and And that is tough to kind of deliver to investors. We've got very understanding investors, and I think the big thing is really learning to communicate and often and keeping them in the loop. And so I think that's what we've done. But I think it's also about whenever you take an investor on, are you taking on the right investor? Because if they don't get what you're doing and why you're doing it, they're not going to be able to help. And so a lot of our investors also help us when we have a problem. You know, we're looking at certain issues, we need to be connected with certain people, and they can kind of do that. And I think it's about creating the right relationship with your investors. But what I will say, the stressful part is actually finding those investors. And so, it's about, we know when our runway is going to end, and we know what we need to do and how much money we need now to expand and capital. And I think that part is really stressful, is how do you find the right people that you're bringing on that will give you money and give you the understanding to really put their trust with your money. So it is hard. But I'm an accountant, so every rand in, I really think about 10 times before that rand gets spent. And I think that mindset has also just helped a bit, because I think from our
I'm
perspective,
sure you're an investor's
again,
dream. There's total accountability and transparency.
yeah, I'm not everyone's dream, because I do say no a lot. But yes, from an investor perspective, I think, there is also confidence in the fact that I am an accountant, that I kind of, they trust in our budgeting. And, one of our investors actually asked me to take them through our budget, and it was terrifying, because I was like, what if this is before they invested, so it was what if they disagree with how we fundamentally are going to spend this? What does that mean? What does that mean for our funding, potential funding? So yeah, I think it can get quite daunting, but I think it is about, you've got to take on the right investors.
And so a question of interest for me would be just around doing something that you're passionate about and building it up from scratch. Would you say you're working more hours than you did as a strategy consultant? Is it the same hours? But where does it lie?
It's more, but they're different hours. I think there was a different level of intensity when it came to consulting. I have a lot more control over my time, and so I know when I work best and what work I need to do. So, I mean, I worked this morning before this call, but it was if I do this work, this is my quiet time, and I can get this out, and it actually makes next week or my team's lives easier. But then I will take downtime elsewhere. I go into the office later than other people, but then I maybe work later than other people. So I think I've got the balance, because I know when I can be flexible, and then but I love what I do, so I do end up working more, and I think that's fine as long as you have the balance. I'm not advocating for working 24/7.
But it sounds, and I'm getting this consistently through these conversations, is that until you've put yourself in the position of starting your own thing, and it's something that you're passionate about, even if you're working longer, you still come across, or you still feel more energized, because it's something that you know is within, and it's something that drives and motivates you, as opposed to working on a case for a client that is in an industry you don't necessarily care about. It's about you want to do well to get your salary and maybe get promoted. It's a very different type of stress, and it's a different type of motivation. And when you're doing it for yourself, and it's something you're deeply passionate about, it aligns with who you are as a person. And I know that sounds fluffy, but consistently through all these chats, people have more energy. And it never clicked to me until I heard it consistently, that when you're doing something that you're passionate about, even if you're working harder, you feel better doing it at the end of the day.
I mean, a lot of the time it doesn't feel like work as well, I would say.
That's amazing.
It's like, if I wasn't doing this, what would I do? I don't know how I would spend my time more productively. So, at least the time I'm spending is adding to something that I have ownership and feel great about. And so that time never feels wasted either, which I think just means it doesn't feel stressful that I worked on a Saturday or Sunday. Well, I don't know when people don't know when we recorded this, but it doesn't feel stressful that I'm doing that. It's like, oh yeah, this thing is a cool thing that I'm working on. I get to work on it, so it's fun. Not all the time, but it's fun.
I find that really, really cool and aspirational. Another question I have is, speaking to a lot of people when they're starting out something and they don't really know where to go, their general answer is, "Oh yeah, Google will give you most of the answers you're looking for." Now, in your space, where it's things are being created from scratch, how much did you use Google early on to figure out? Maybe not so much in terms of the biotech companies out there that you wanted to look at, but actually understanding the science behind it. Was it as simple as just Google it and you'll get 70% of what you need? Is that advice you can share with people in such a specialized industry?
I look, say what you want about Google, but it's helpful in any regard. And I think, yeah, it doesn't change, even though it's more technical. I think whether you get across a paper which you then have to read, but there are, whether it's a YouTube video that comes up, or I found this institution that I found these reports at, by searching for it. And so I searched for the right platforms, and now I'm on the right platforms and know where to look. But initially, I think even now, our team still does a lot of like desktop research to get answers to things. And then they do like research papers and things like that. But if someone's talking about something scientific, I will first just Google it and like, what is the first two responses that are just the summary versions are usually good enough to continue having a conversation, good enough for me to ask the right questions. Because it's not about me being a complete expert in the topic. It's about me just knowing where and what questions I need to ask to really get the right
Mm.
responses from my team who are experts on those fields. So no, Google is your friend. Google is definitely your friend.
And I think that's it's firstly, I think it's excellent to know that. Second, I think what's interesting is also your point is where you are in the business, and at the point is you don't have to know everything, right? You need to know enough to understand if you're moving in the right direction or not. And I think that's also an important thing for people listening. If they're moving into an industry they don't know, do you need to know everything, or do you need to know enough to know whether you're moving in the right direction or not? Um, Taz, maybe talk to me about when you reflect back now. So you've been with Mzansi Meat Co for, I think the journey with Mzansi Meat Co has been just over 2 years, if I'm not mistaken. Looking back, what have been some of the biggest highlights over that time, and also some of the biggest challenges?
Let me start with challenges so I can end with highlights. But I think I think challenges are, you're starting a new industry, you're starting it with a team that hasn't worked in the space, so everything is new. And I think the challenge is just like not knowing what you don't know. And I think it's a continuous challenge. There's consistent things that are changing and shifting and learning to be done. But I think it was, we didn't know how long things would take us. And I think that was a big challenge because it meant it was harder to plan, it was harder to fundraise, it was harder to do everything else because
Mm.
we would miss deadlines because we just didn't know how long the science would take. And I think we're now in a much better position. But I think that was very hard. I think we talked a little bit about how do we start communicating with our R&D team and us, and I think that was a big challenge to get over. Is like, how do we, as this company at the time of 4 to 5 people, not know how to communicate with one another? We sit in the same room and we can't communicate, and I think that was a big challenge and learning for us. Is how do we start speaking the same language? So that was quite tough, and I think this one is probably still quite a pervasive one. Is fundraising is really hard. It takes a lot of
Mm.
time, and it's very. I am very sympathetic of every South African entrepreneur who's trying to raise money because we have a harder time doing it. Africa is an overlooked market. Um, you know, the money exists, the money just doesn't flow here. And so I think that is still quite a challenge, is showcasing what we're doing to the rest of the world so that people look at it favorably and want to invest. People, they do exist, but it's hard. It's really, really difficult. And in terms of highlights, I think the big highlight really, getting that burger, getting to taste it was incredible. I think that's been really, really amazing. I think what we've achieved in 2 years for me, the team that we have, where we are, is just really exciting. I think we've gotten to become quite a cohesive team. Who is going about the industry in the way that we want to go about it, fully transparent, showcasing what we're doing, and really doing it for the right reasons, which I think is just incredible. So I would say those two are really, really up there for me.
And did COVID impact you guys in any way, or and how did you navigate that? Because you guys would have been very early in your journey when COVID really hit.
Mzansi was registered in March 2020, 2 weeks before
Oh my
2 weeks
goodness.
before the hard lockdown, which a lot of people kind of think, oh gosh, how unlucky. But I think when that's all you know, that is the environment you learned to grow and do things. It's very different if we had started a couple of months before, where we were used to a certain level of operation and then had to adjust. But this was the environment. One thing I would say is, like, it made our jobs easier to fundraise. COVID really shed light on food insecurity and food inefficiencies across the board, and so a lot more people were thinking about what does it mean and what does it mean for actually places like Africa, and so that kind of helped us quite a bit. And then I think, we probably wouldn't have had as many kind of Zoom meetings with investors that weren't in South Africa. We were able to talk to literally everyone because that's the only way anyone was ever talking to one another. And so now it's become the norm, and it's a great established norm, even though I said I don't like remote work. But it's a great established norm that we can do these video calls, because we won't have as much access to investors if this hadn't become, more standard. And so, there were certain parts that were challenging. I mean, it's never great if your 3 to 5 person team and 1 to 2 people get COVID at the same time, or at any point. That's your business really does stop operations, especially if it's one of your R&D team and one of them are sick. And so being a small team and kind of having to stay at home for initially what was 14 days is an insane amount of time, which is just scary for a team. But as a whole, it was largely quite positive for our team.
I love what you said about just having more Zoom calls than and meeting more investors than you would have imagined. I think COVID really has done wonders in the sense of you can build trust and rapport with someone virtually, whereas previously that was a big no. It's like, how can I trust someone who I've never met? And companies have had to change, and you literally hire people without ever seeing them. I mean, I had a colleague who was pregnant, and you don't even notice it, and then one day on the call it's like, here's my baby. You're like, wait, you were pregnant? You forget about it. And it's just amazing how the world has changed, and I think so great. So do you have a lot of funding that's coming outside of South Africa as a result, or is it predominantly in South Africa?
Predominantly external to South Africa. So
Sure.
I think we've got a few South African investors, but majority of our funds have come from external sources.
And I want to go back to your background. So being a CA, going through strategy consulting. When it came to running your own business, were there any misconceptions you had, and which now that you've been running it, you're like, "Jeepers, why did I think that way initially?" Or, is there anything of the sort where you thought running a business would be like X, Y, and Z, but it's turned out completely different?
I thought it would be easy. It's very hard. No,
I was not expecting that.
no, I thought not that I thought that running a business would be easy, but let me clarify. I thought certain aspects would be easy, but I think the things that take up a lot more time are things like HR and recruiting and all these things which you can take for granted when you build the business, but actually are fundamental frameworks that you need to make sure that your business is successful in the long run. And so I think I think about a lot of the time I spent, and a lot of them are admin related when it comes down to it, is, making sure that the office is set up and, that it's fully functional and the team has, things like snacks, those things I took for granted in my previous job. There was food, there was snacks, there was things. I didn't have to worry about payroll or, how are we going to manage leave and how are we going to, I don't have to think about those things. And I think as you grow and you have more people, you have to have more set processes, and someone's got to do it. And when it's a team of R&D people and they're 2 business people, Brett and I, those are the things that we're working on, plus fundraising, plus managing the company, plus all these things. And so I think, I took for granted how much time the other things take. which are so fundamental.
You remind me of my parents telling me I was taking them for granted as a kid. Like, you don't understand all these small things, how much time it takes. But that I can imagine. And if you have a team of 7, getting an extra person, like, it should take time, because that's 12.5% of the company ethos that you're bringing in, right? And if you get the wrong person, it can change the vibe and how everyone interacts with one another. So I completely get it. It is an area that I'd say is very easy to overlook. So it's very interesting to hear. Taz, when you look out 5 years into the future for Mzansi Meat Co, what are you hoping the business will be looking like, and what successes would you have had?
I hope that you can go into grocery stores, Woolworths, Checkers, and pull Mzansi meat off the shelf at a good price point, which we're working on. But my hope is in 5 years' time that it's no longer what is cultivated meat. It's what is the next thing, and what is the future of food beyond that. But it should be on shelf, and it should be available to people to consume. And I think Mzansi's name should be on there, and people know us as the brand that brought this to market.
And any advice for people looking at you and thinking this is very inspiring, and they want to start something on their own also? What advice would you give people?
I think you just got to take a leap. It's difficult, but it's so unbelievably rewarding. I think you have to put in a lot of effort, but you get a lot back. And so I would say, I think it took me a while to actually make the leap, but when you do, you'll know it's right. But I think it's just about actually taking the leap and doing it, and seeing where it goes. And I think sometimes you're in an easier position to do that. I was in a transition point in my career, and I had flexibility to do that. But I think there are ways to create that flexibility for yourself as well. How do you create the right environment to be able to take the leap? And I think you can do it. And I think there are also environments that you can work in where you can start working and tinkering on other projects. And so I think find the right environments if you're not ready to take or can't financially take that leap. Find the right way to take the leap, because it's possible. Maybe it requires just working on weekends to get something to a certain point before you can really give it your full attention. But I think it takes a bit of sacrifice, but it's definitely worth it.
And so 3 personal questions as we wind down to the end of the podcast. So the first one is, are you proud of yourself, and why?
I think having pride is very strange. I think it's it's an interesting question, and definitely I think done to put someone on the spot. I'm very excited about what I'm doing, and I'm happy, and I think that's what I strive for. I think if I'm happy, then that's kind of the state that I'm most excited about being in. I think pride is a different kind of emotion there, but like, that's my goal in life. How do I get to a point that I'm happy? And I think for a long time, I've always wanted to contribute to something bigger than me, and that's what I'm doing, and that makes me happy as well.
Perfect. I've never seen anyone answer the question and really look at the word pride, but I like the answer. I like the answer. Now that you've been on the podcast and you understand what it's about, right? Is there any self-starter that you, or someone that you know whose self-starter story has helped you or inspired you, that you think it would be worth hearing from?
There's so many people. I'm constantly in awe of just in general entrepreneurs. I think I've definitely kind of been in this industry. I think the people that I look to are people that are making waves in this industry. So there's a company, and they're the first company to sell cultivated meat in the world. They're called Just. They're a US company. So the founder, kind of Josh Tetrick, is really super inspiring with what he's been able to do and kind of take his company to. And so, yeah, I'm very inspired by the entrepreneurs in this space, and in general entrepreneurs. So it's really cool to see their journeys. But he's probably a cool one.
That's awesome. Do you know him?
Brett has his WhatsApp, so yeah, we're in contact in some way. I haven't spoken to him directly, but I will at some point.
Well, if he's ever looking to share his story in South Africa, you know I'd be willing to chat to him. And now, last question, Taz. If you were somehow to stand in front of 6-year-old you, what about your journey up until this point would you tell her to look forward to the most?
That is a very interesting question. Um, I mean, I don't think there's like, I think life is about the journey. So I do think it's like, I don't, I'm a person that actually personally doesn't believe in regrets. I think you learn from everything that you do. And so I really would kind of more just give the advice of just savor the journey. The hard things are hard for a reason, and the good things are that just makes it so much better because you have had to work hard for it. So I'd say just savor the journey. It's an exciting one. I feel like very like happy about the journey that I've had, and just excited about the future. There's so many cool things going. There's so many cool people doing cool stuff, and I get to see that every day, kind of in my job, which I'm just really happy about.
That's awesome. Taz, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. I think as someone who's had a fairly similar journey to you in the sense of being a CA, going to strategy consulting, you really are inspirational, and I'm in awe of what you're doing. I think it's incredible, and I really look forward to seeing just how well Mzansi Meat Co does into the future. So yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.